The phrase improvement upon perfection is often viewed as an oxymoron. After all, doesn't being perfect mean something is the best it can be? How then could anything possibly improve upon it? But after thinking on this phrase, I don't think improving upon perfection is impossible. I can think of one very clear example.
My past games ranking lists. I mean, these are basically perfect, but I'm pretty darn sure I can make them even better. I only want to slightly change the rankings of one of these, but I have a bit to say about each of them. So we're going to go back in time starting with my still incomplete 2021 list and talk about how my thinking on some of these games has changed.
2021. Since this was just last year's list, I don't have a lot to say. However, I did mention getting Mario Party Superstars and not having time to really play it. I have since played Superstars and I would like to place it right here. I don't have a lot to say about it. I do wish there were options to play without CPUs with 3 or less players. You would have to remove some team-based games from the minigame list, but that's fine. Most of these I feel could work on their own. But yeah, it's a good Mario Party game. It's exactly as unfair and unbalanced as you expect, and that's just what I wanted out of Mario Party. 2020. Since this list was finally finished in September of last year, I put more thought into choosing games placements, so there's not a lot to talk about. The only slight change in opinion I want to add is that rather than having a small gap between Origami King and Xenoblade, the latter has started to move ahead in favorability a lot more and its fast gaming speed on Age of Calamity. That's not to say it'll surpass the game, but I do think it's worth mentioning that instead of liking Xenoblade a little more than Origami King, I now like Xenoblade quite a bit more than Origami King. Similarly, in 2019, I would say the only addendum is that the gap between Luigi's Mansion 3 and Ahead in Time has widened. 2018. Now this list was extremely rushed, easily the one I'm the least proud of, so I do have a bit more to say. Deltarune Chapter 1 is an interesting case. I said almost nothing about this game, and I still am for now, but you'll see why soon. So really, the main reason I put Smash at the top isn't even because it's a crossover like I said. Honestly, yes, that's huge. This game contains Splatoon content, so that already gives it part of the inherent advantage Octo Expansion has of simply being a Splatoon game, but the main reason it's at the top is because it's an excellent party game. I play this almost every time I see friends, and it's the type of game that just about anyone can enjoy. Even if you just play it casually, it's fun to screw around in. I don't think I properly expressed just how much I loved Octo Expansion. Truthfully, this is the opposite of the previous segments where I said the gap was really close and it widened over time. I claimed there was an obvious gap here that Smash was easily the best, but truthfully, Octo Expansion is right up there with it, just barely missing the top spot solely because it's a single player only experience as opposed to Smash, which you can sink hundreds of hours into. And now we finally arrived at the main list I want to talk about, the first one I ever made, 2017. In general, I tried too hard to be funny in this one. Like, there was one cringy joke about having a new Sandbox Mario title being like finding an intelligent Trump cabinet member, or I made a little joke about being a leftist where I wear a Stalin tee.
If it isn't obvious, I don't actually like Stalin. This is my attempt at poking fun at the notion that everyone on the left is a Stalin-era communist. But the problem is I forgot to make the joke funny.
So if you decide to watch my 2017 video and find yourself cringing at some of the jokes, trust me, I know they're bad. Lately, I've tried to work in jokes only if it makes me laugh thinking about them, which is why you only get a few sprinkled throughout rather than me constantly trying to force a comical line. During the Breath of the Wild segment, I made a comment about something being your favorite without it necessarily being the best. For this, I took an image of The Room and had it fade into an image of the Star Wars logo. I sort of chose these as examples just based off what popped into my head, but they're not really the greatest to showcase what I'm talking about. The Room isn't a great example of your favorite because I'm not referring to the idea of something so bad it's good. I think a better example would be to have an MCU movie morph into one that's considered high art. All MCU movies are flawed to some extent, but you might like one more than some artsy movie simply because it fills you with thrills the high art movie doesn't. And on said artsy movie side, it might technically be a better movie, we'll say the best for the sake of comparison, but you may not like it as much as the MCU movie simply because you're more into the simple fun of the MCU movie. That's how I feel about Twilight Princess and Breath of the Wild. I think Breath of the Wild is the better game, but I love everything about Twilight Princess so much I would rank it above Breath of the Wild personally. Then there are specific games I want to talk about this list, starting with Splatoon 2. First, I want to talk about what I said about the Squid Sister beef back then and where I land on it today. At the time, I was very much Team Callie, and although I still held a grudge against Marie, I had started to hate her less and was trying to see them as equals. Since then, my position on which I prefer hasn't changed one bit, but I do definitely like Marie a lot more now, upon realizing that the problem isn't Marie, it's Nintendo of America's translation of Marie. NOA basically translated Marie from a loving best friend similar to Pearl and Marina to someone who is spiteful towards Callie, and this change in behavior was essentially responsible for a good amount of the toxicity in the Splatoon fandom in its early days. That's not to say we wouldn't see any waifu wars among Splatoon fans, but I think there would be a lot more lighthearted jesting about the matter, like we mostly see today, as opposed to the vehement hatred Callie and Marie fans felt towards each other in the days of 1. I have also realized NOA in general doesn't translate nearly as accurately as I thought they did. There are several other pieces of dialogue added just to make a funny joke that end up directly contradicting or confusing the lore of the series. This isn't just an issue with Splatoon, but NOA as a whole. But I digress, we don't have time to go over all of that. I'll also add here that Splatoon 2 keeps its number 5 spot based on where it was at the end of 2017, but if we included the completed Splatoon 2 experience, plus Octo Expansion, this would be ahead of Earthbound. Octo Expansion adds that much value to the game, and honestly, I wish it was sold separately so I could suggest it to friends without them having to buy a $60 game that's going to become irrelevant in September. Oh, and I also want to say that I made a joke, don't you dare complain about spoilers, this is a 4-month-old game. Now this did act as a spoiler warning, but I now heavily disagree with the notion of, oh, it's okay to spoil this thing because it's this old. I echoed that sentiment at the time solely because it was something I saw commonly, and I fed into it. Today though, I've come to realize games that could have had major effects on me didn't, because they were spoiled. For example, Majora's Mask could have been amazing if I got to play it as anything more than just a Zelda game. But unfortunately, there are so many Zelda tubers who will just spoil stuff about the game without a warning solely because it's old and they figure, I'm sure anyone watching this video has played any Zelda I might talk about here. I definitely get that sentiment. The thing is, there are always people first getting into a fandom who won't know everything that's assumed to be public knowledge. I'm not trying to throw shade or anything, I'm just saying I think we should have heavy, clear spoiler warnings before talking about anything, even pieces of media that came out before any of us currently inhabiting the Earth were born. During the Undertale segment, I brought up how I wasn't one for most logic-based RPGs. Now, I already stated this during the Xenoblade segment of my 2020 games list, but I've heavily reevaluated this statement. Honestly, I've barely played any RPGs, so it was completely unfair for me to say this. 2017 was like when I was first starting to open up to new genres, so I sort of just convinced myself RPGs didn't look fun and therefore they weren't fun. I've also come to see how dumb I was for classifying all RPGs as turn-based combat. There's so many different forms of RPGs as well, and it's more of a class of games with its own subgenres than one uniform genre like racing games. I mean, there are people who argue that Breath of the Wild is an RPG, and I don't agree with them, but I can definitely see where they're coming from. I also made a weird comment on Undertale, saying something like it had every genre of music. That's not really a good way of putting it at all. What I was really trying to get at is that Undertale's OST covers every possible mood and matches up perfectly with the context each piece is used in. With Earthbound, we're starting to get into why I wanted to go back over my previous lists here in the first place. Let me state this up front. I loved Earthbound. It absolutely earned its place above Mario Odyssey. It is an experience I'll never forget. However, I over-exaggerated when I made this list. It wasn't that I was purposefully lying to you, the audience. I was lying to myself. At the time, I wanted to be an Earthbound fan. I knew that those who loved the game mostly considered it their favorite RPG, often their favorite game. I wanted to be part of that. I wanted to have as much passion for this game as they did. So I told myself I did. I didn't go all the way in telling myself it was my favorite game, period, but I did convince myself it was my favorite RPG, at the very least. But in truth, it didn't hit me quite as hard as I made it out to. I mentioned the game filled me with an emotion I hadn't felt since the first time I played a Zelda game. While that sounds like high praise, that emotion was really just the feeling of playing a long-beloved series you've always wanted to get into. I'm not saying that there's nothing special about Earthbound or that I completely overestimated the value of this game, but I was so blinded by wanting to love it, I failed to recognize my love for another game. Unlike all my other lists, where I kept my rankings the same and just wanted to clarify some things, I actually am changing the 2017 list. Earthbound is getting moved back, but not behind Odyssey. There's another game that's moving in front of Mother 2. But before we get to that, there's one last game on my 2017 list.
When I opened this video with a line about perfection, I think it's pretty obvious I wasn't actually talking about my past videos, especially seeing that up until this point, this entire video has been me correcting my past work. So let's get into the real reason why I chose that opening line.
Breath of the Wild, a game I proclaim to be literally perfect, undeniably a 10 out of 10. I want to stress that this is still one of my favorite games ever. Probably my favorite Switch exclusive, and yes, I would still consider it the greatest game ever made. But honestly, I don't think I can call it perfect. Now, hold on, how can I consider this the greatest game of all time and still claim it's not perfect? Not necessarily a 10 out of 10 for everyone. Well, I need to define what a perfect game is first. The dictionary definition of perfect, or at least when used as a verb, is make something completely free from faults or defects, or as close to such a condition as possible. So my definition of a perfect game is as follows. A game that manages to do everything it tries to without any inherent flaws. This is a bit of an open-ended definition, but that's so it can adapt to a wide variety of different games. One easy example I can provide for a perfect game is Tetris, specifically the NES version of the game. Tetris may not evoke the same kinds of feelings as Breath of the Wild, but for a simple puzzle game where you line up blocks to clear out rows, it does that without introducing any issues. The reason I chose the NES version is because it's so well engineered, it's the version of the classic Tetris World Championships still used today. I would consider Breath of the Wild a better game than NES Tetris in my own eyes, because its scope is simply far beyond a simple puzzle game. Breath of the Wild encapsulates the sense of adventure and exploring a wide fantasy world better than any other game I've played. Hyrule feels like a living, breathing place. There's something to discover in every corner of the map and up on top of the walls forming that corner. It encourages experimentation with its mechanics with freedom few games allow. But I can't consider it absolutely flawless like Tetris. There are certain things others complain about that I don't find as big of an issue, like the weapon durability system, but I have my own set of complaints. BOTW has a great backstory, but not the most exciting ongoing story. It lacks typical Zelda dungeons, which are one aspect of the old games I never want to see phased out. Its music is nice, but the game lacks many of the orchestral epic pieces the series is known for. It is, in my opinion, the greatest game I've ever played for everything it does right, but it isn't perfect as I see ways for Nintendo to improve upon this formula, and hopefully they will in the sequel. So given my current definition, it may sound like only extremely simple games can be perfect. The more complexity a game adds, the more flaws and subjectivity it risks having. So, what would a more complex, perfect game look like? Well, it would have to be perfect in every way it tries to be. The gameplay would need to be fun, with no tedious or annoying aspects. The story would need to evoke everything it wants to when it wants to, with no narrative dissonance. Its soundtrack would not only have to sound fantastic out of context, but work even better alongside the situations it's used in. It would have to be the type of game that could only exist as a video game, yet manage to reach the same emotional heights as any other form of storytelling. It would have to do all of this without a single flaw in any area. This game couldn't just be perfect as a game, but as a piece of art. Let me give a massive spoiler warning for this game. If you haven't played it yet and you're watching this, please go play it. I know by this point you probably think you've no interest, but you might be surprised by this game's quality. Seriously, if you don't know what happens in this game yet, go play it blind, then watch this video.
Realistically, Undertale shouldn't have been put on this list. I put it here as the PS4 version launched in 2017, but I didn't even play that version. This should have been put on a 2015 list, but 2017 was my first time doing these, and I wanted an excuse to talk about the game, so I stuck it on there. So we're gonna pretend it makes sense to have it here, and just keep it.
When I first ranked Undertale as number 4 in 2017, I think I had vastly undervalued the game in my own head. Surely I couldn't like this game more than Mario, but I do. Surely I can't like Undertale more than the much longer RPG that inspired it, but I honestly enjoy Undertale more than Earthbound. Earthbound is wonderful, but I truly think that Toby Fox surpassed his inspiration. Much like how I overvalued my experience with Earthbound wanting to fit in with its fandom, I undervalued my experience with Undertale, not wanting to rank the game higher than the many incredible games released in 2017. But it deserves it. Undertale is at least my second game of 2017, and I'm still debating in my own head whether it should be just below Breath of the Wild or tied with it. The thing is, Undertale has grown on me throughout the years. As time passes on, I grow even more fond of this game, of every aspect of it. What it means to me only increases. When I first made that list, it hadn't even been quite 2 years since I played the game, and at the time I was convincing myself I didn't actually love it that much. I thought my feelings for it would always be fond, but they would fade, much like they did with Origami King, which I discussed earlier. Obviously, though, that didn't happen, because Undertale isn't just fun. I stated that I wasn't sure where to place Doki Doki Literature Club on my 2021 list, because it's entirely different from all the other games which are just plain fun. But Undertale, as strange as this sounds, manages to capture many of the same feelings as Doki Doki, and is also as fun as the other games. It captures everything I love about games. The only thing preventing a Toby Fox game from earning my Game of the Year is that they consistently launch alongside either a Zelda game, Splatoon game, or Smash, which encapsulates both. And now Undertale itself too, with the Sans costume. I could ramble all day about what this game means to me, a statement which itself is becoming a bit of a cliche in Undertale videos. So let's get back to the pretty bold claim I made earlier that Undertale is a perfect game. I've tried to think of something I dislike about this game, of some flaw, but after considering everything, I honestly can't come up with a single issue. The art style is one thing I see some complaints about. Sure, Undertale isn't the prettiest looking game ever at all times, but that's because it's only pretty when it wants to be. By keeping the design of most rooms of the game simple with solid colors for the ground, it lets the interactable elements pop out so you know what's just background and what you can check out. Then when the game does throw a well-designed pixel art background at you, it sticks with you a lot more than it would in a game which consistently has that level of design all throughout. The underground feels just claustrophobic enough that you understand the suffering of the monsters trapped beneath the Earth's crust, but it's expansive enough for you to fall in love with it in the amount of time you walk through its many areas. The lack of a run button is another thing I've seen brought up, but once again, I don't see this as an issue. In most games, yes, this could become incredibly tedious, but Undertale wants you to interact with just about every item or person in a room. A lot of games don't put much effort into the NPC's dialogue, so many players have adopted the act of just running past anybody without a quest marker above their head. By restricting the character's movement, new players will be more inclined to check out and read every bit of text attached to an object, which obviously benefits a game this well written. There's very little backtracking too. Even when you do move back to previous areas, you're likely to find the NPCs you've already passed now have new things to say. Enabling a run button from the start would result in many players missing much of the charming dialogue and witty jokes strewn throughout this world, which is, in my opinion, the main draw of Undertale. I saw one post complaining about the boss fights not having obvious solutions in the pacifist route, but they completely missed the point that Undertale's fights, in general, are supposed to be puzzles. The game does give you hints on how to solve each character, so you should eventually figure it out if you just pay close attention. While I'm on fights, I may as well bring up that Undertale actively solves issues with battle systems in other RPGs. In games like Pokemon, I always hated how there was no way to prevent damage from the enemies. You could block and reduce damage, but your health bar would always go down a little bit throughout fights against even just basic enemies. Undertale's bullet hell system solves this completely. Making the enemy's attacks actual bullet patterns you have to dodge around to avoid damage rewards the player for their skill and never leaves you feeling like you just needed to grind more in order to get stronger. That's another thing Undertale does away with entirely. Because you're not supposed to kill enemies, you're never supposed to level up. So the game is balanced to let you simply run away from as many battles as you want without consequence. The last complaint isn't even something the game can be faulted for. Those who aren't fans will often say, well, I'm not a fan of the characters. It's acceptable not to be, but that doesn't mean the game's character writing is flawed or that it's imperfect because some people don't like the characters. It just means it's not their thing. The fact that these characters are over the top is part of the game's charm, and if you're not into that comedic style of writing, you're not going to be a fan of the game. But it not being your thing can't be taken as a slight against it. For me and so many others, the characters hit every emotional beat they needed to. Undertale's writing is genius because Toby Fox realized all you have to do to get a good majority of people to like a character is inject them with funny. By bombarding the player with humor from just about every character and even object from the game, it's hard not to fall in love with every monster you encounter. Then, using this attachment you formed with these characters because of their witty dialogue, the game takes the reins to your emotions and steers them in any direction it desires. The game's central message of showing love to everyone seeps into you, and achieving everyone's goal of leaving the underground becomes just as important to you as it is to them. What's even more incredible about this game is how the narration itself has so much character, because it is one. You play as the human Frisk, but the first fallen human and Azrael's sibling, Chara, is the one you name and listen to every time you check out a non-living object. It's a common misconception that Chara is evil, but they're not. They have a negative view of humans for reasons left a mystery, but it can be heavily inferred they believe their own kind to be a hateful, resentful species who only want to wipe out the monster kind. When you arrive and proceed to show everyone kindness, then, you're showing them that's not all humans are. You're showing them a kindness and love they never knew in their own species, and by refusing to hurt anyone, not a single soul, even they overcome their inner darkness, you giving them the chance to hug their brother one last time. But it was simple curiosity. The curiosity of a single person that destroyed the universe and created a new one. You'll notice I'm borrowing footage now because I refuse to play the genocide route to completion myself. After forming attachments to all of the characters, the last thing I want to do is kill them all. Although the genocide route is something I won't ever play, I would argue it's also perfect. Everything Undertale uses to its advantage in the pacifist route is used to make genocide more painful. It's not fun to play by design. Whereas the pacifist route fills the world with fun interactions and dialogue at every turn, the genocide route quickly forgoes these, making your slow walking speed exactly the hindrance it would be in a lesser game. I briefly mentioned grinding earlier, and this is another aspect I dislike in most RPGs that Undertale purposefully uses to make the dark route less fun. You're forced to tediously walk around in circles waiting for enemies to fight. Once you do finally get into a battle, the expertly designed puzzles of combat are wasted for another generic task of whittling down the enemy's health bars to zero. Your time is effectively wasted, not for fun, but just to find out what happens. When considering what makes the genocide route so effective in a sea of games that pretend to be cheery, that turn out to be something else, is that this time the game really is cheery. I mentioned Doki Doki Literature Club earlier. Don't worry, I won't spoil anything explicitly. But many games that slowly start to derail and become different experiences from what they're quote-unquote supposed to be are actually just pretending, Doki Doki included. In other words, DDLC is a horror game and it only exists for us as a horror game. The backstory is that it's supposed to be a cute dating game that turns into a horror game, The thing is, there's no way to play the original Doki Doki Literature Club without the horror aspects happening. There is no route in reality where the game truly is just a cute dating game. I wouldn't count this against Doki Doki, as one of that game's themes is the lack of control. Allowing you to find a happy ending without anything scary or depressing happening would go against that idea. However, Undertale is about choice. What makes the game brilliant is we actually get to see the good path that's stripped away in the genocide route. Said good path is Undertale if played normally. Then, as the player works their way through the underground, which they're emptying more and more with every battle, they're not just envisioning what a happy route of the game would look like. They know what it's supposed to look like. They can remember every interaction they're missing, all due to their own sadistic actions. There's actually one last complaint to counter. Lack of additional save files. In most games, I would be against this, but in Undertale, it's important that there is only one. Once you reach the end of the game and give everyone the freedom they've hoped for, some of which for their entire lives, you have to undo your own actions in order to do a genocide route. If you were just able to create another save file and have all your monster friends happy in one file and dead in another, it would remove the effect of taking away what they had. With one save file, you're forced to consider whether it's really more important to you to see what happens, or whether you would rather leave your new friends be to live out their lives. If the pacifist route is showing Chara what good humans can possess, then the genocide route is showing them the exact opposite. Since it's almost certain you've done the pacifist route before moving on to genocide 2, this means you're not just showing Chara the evil in people, you're showing them the evil within the person who just showed them the good in humans. Everything they learned in the pacifist route about a human who showed love to everyone is now contrasted with the fact that same person is going through the underground killing everyone they were once friends with no motivation other than simple curiosity. Undertale is a bright, joyous time for the majority of its pacifist route, which makes the genocide route that much more of a brutal, tedious slog that reveals less about the game than it does about the player, and the lengths will go to just for unimportant knowledge. I still wind up with tears streaming down my face just thinking about this game today, 7 years later. It manages to convey every emotion a game can, right when it needs to, all without any flaws in story or gameplay. By all accounts, I consider it a perfect game. It's funny because I feel like Undertale is almost the exact opposite of Breath of the Wild. Whereas the latest Zelda is a testament to how incredibly vast and monumental video games can be, with a massive studio and hundreds of names in the credits, Undertale shows that one person equipped with ideas and Game Maker Studio can make a 9-hour adventure that's just as powerful, in completely different ways. This cute 16-bit game about a kid trying to escape from a hole is just as important to me as this magnum opus of grand adventure game, developed by a billion-dollar company to the point where I'm not even sure which should be my 2017 Game of the Year. But hey, speaking of, wasn't I supposed to discuss my Game of 2021 here? Well, there was no new Zelda or Splatoon game released last year.
Deltarune Chapter 2 is not just my favorite game of last year, but in many ways an improvement upon Undertale.
Once again, let me provide a massive spoiler warning for both Chapter 2 and Chapter 1. Before we cover 2 though, I want to talk about Chapter 1 and my thoughts on it in 2018 versus now. All I really said in 2018 was that I felt the game mechanics were improved from Undertale, I liked the story but not quite as much as Undertale, and I was looking forward to the future. I still echo all of those points, but I'd like to go into more detail. So, I loved Deltarune Chapter 1, but one thing I failed to bring up is how it did feel like something was missing to really bring it to the same heights as its predecessors reached. Mechanics-wise, I could see a lot of potential in the new party system, but it didn't seem fully fleshed out. When I called it an improvement, I guess I really meant it had the potential to outdo Undertale's solo combat. Similarly, the story was definitely setting up something cool, but Chapter 1's story was pretty simple compared to Undertale. My feelings on Susie were quite mixed, since she spent most of the game working against you, and she seemed a bit murder-y for a redeemable Toby Fox character. I started to like her near the end of the game, but by the time she fully embraces Chris, the game is almost over, so you don't get much time to hang out with the good version of her. The ending where you got to explore the town was really cool and honestly my favorite part of Chapter 1. That final twist of Chris ripping their soul from their body and pulling a knife out though, God, what a cliffhanger to end on. So Chapter 1 was really cool, but it seemed at the time less like Undertale's sequel, more like a promise of what the heck Undertale's sequel could look like. Then I played Chapter 2 and realized, that's because Chapter 1 is just a tutorial. Chapter 2 is so good, it made me retroactively love 1 more. Now that Susie is on our side for basically the entire chapter, she gets to shine beyond what we saw of her in Chapter 1. Then I realized Chapter 1 is basically entirely devoted to Susie's character arc. Whereas I sort of missed this by the time I completed Chapter 1, I've now realized that the start of Deltarune heavily shows that Susie would never actually kill anyone. She'll hurt them really badly, but she refuses to actually inflict mortal damage on any of the enemies she encounters. It's all just a tough girl persona. We get to spend all of Chapter 1 watching Susie develop from a bully to a legitimately great friend, so then Chapter 2 comes along and, dude, she's like one of my favorite characters now. But really, it's hard to choose a favorite character. They're all so well written. I love Noelle, I still love Rousey. Berdly's dialogue sounds like it came straight out of Snapcube Sonic fandom. Queen is the perfect villain for such an upbeat, silly chapter. Susie might still inconvenience you, but it's funny now. Heck, Rudy Holiday is a strong contender for favorite characters, and he's restricted to one room you can only access at the end of each chapter. Toby Fox is setting up an arc for Rudy, which is looking to be either completely heartwarming or beyond heartbreaking. And it better be the former, do you hear me, dog? The chemistry between these characters is the backbone of Chapter 2's experience, and I've now realized it was the best part of 1 as well. The party system improves not just the battles, but the story itself. Battles already made cool changes in letting you see your characters and the enemies on screen actually launching attacks, and playing more with the shapes and sizes of the bullet hell boxes you need to dodge it. Chapter 2 improved it further. Chapter 1 didn't really have a way to encourage the player to engage with battles peacefully beyond the moments in the story that require non-violence, and the player intrigue of seeing how things might change. Chapter 2 though adds the recruitment system, encouraging players to solve battles peacefully without making you kill defeated enemies. As if that all wasn't already a direct improvement, the party system allows for more intricate puzzles than possible in Undertale. In Chapter 1, actions were limited to just Chris, meaning Susie and Rousey couldn't have much effect on the battle beyond helping Chris. But now that all 3 party members can perform actions, the gates are wide open for even more intricate battles. The party option also means you can perform actions and spare in a single turn, allowing you to deal with easier enemies who only require one action to be spared quicker. And enemies who require multiple actions to spare now have a spare meter, allowing the player to make more informed decisions based on how much farther they need to go. Getting back to the characters' chemistry, the party system is even better outside of battle. I think Undertale's solo adventure works better for its story. You're a sole child wandering through the underground, either making friends with or attacking everyone you see. Leaving the player by themselves makes more sense in that world, as monsters don't really have reason to attack each other. Thematically, letting the player have their sole influence on everyone they meet works perfectly. But Deltarune is telling a different story, so the party system simply allows for even better chemistry outside of battle. Because Chris is a silent protagonist, giving them party members allows for character interaction between both the characters working towards your goal and your opponents. In Undertale, enemies would speak to you, but you wouldn't say much of anything back to them. This really let the characters shine directly without input from anyone else. Now though, you have party members to have funny or meaningful interactions and speak for you without Chris himself opening their mouth. Fox can give and take other party members on a moment's notice, allowing for fluctuations not just in power, but in tone. If Fox wants Chris to be alone like in Undertale, he can just find a reason to remove the rest of the party. If a section will work best with just Chris and Susie, all Fox needs is a clever excuse to separate Rousey. Controlling what characters Chris is traveling with at any given time allows more creative control not just over the player's power, but the direction of the story. And Deltarune's story showcases Fox's strong suit in writing even better, now with constant interactions between the characters, rather than having every character speak primarily for themselves. Involving Noelle and Berdly was the best decision Fox could have made. Chapter 1 already had some fun interactions between the main cast, but the chemistry between everyone in the party, Noelle, Susie, Berdly, Rousey, and Chris, It's amazing. Every character is so perfectly written to bounce off of one another, and once you throw the goofball villain Queen in there, the story's writing is somehow even more charming than Undertale's. If Undertale was a subdued experience of visiting a friend's house to hang out for a few hours, Deltarune is a chaotic day out on the town with a group. At some points you'll all be together in one place, but you also get separated. Your group will split off into pairs. 1 minute, two friends will be talking, the next, each of them have separated to have different conversations with different people. You'll travel around together and meet up in various, constantly changing formations. You'll pass by some people multiple times without even stopping to check in. At the end of the day, you'll be drained, but you'll undoubtedly have had a great time, amongst the noise of your busy day. That's what Deltarune Chapter 2 feels like. Starting you off with Susie, Chris, and Rose, introducing Noelle, introducing Berdly, having you fight Berdly, having Rose and Susie split off from you, having you join up with Noelle, making Berdly constantly interrupt you. It continues the entire game like this, splitting the group into different formations. By the end, the chaos melds into one of the funniest adventures you'll ever look back on. There's so many little ways the game improves upon Undertale 2. The sprite work is just straight up improved, and since the dark worlds aren't really supposed to seem like traps, this doesn't negatively impact the tone in any way. You now have a run button, which you might think I'd consider a flaw since this game also encourages interaction with just about everything you pass, but I don't because this game was specifically built to be played after Undertale. Because players have likely already played Undertale before Deltarune, they'll go in knowing to interact with everything they see already, understanding every text box is worth reading. You also have multiple save files. Again, I think this works for Deltarune because it's covering the idea of player influence in a completely different way. Deltarune seems to be less focused on the idea of sparing everyone. After all, enemies run away before you can kill them, meaning even purposeful violence isn't as frowned upon as in Undertale. Deltarune seems to be focusing even more on the idea of the player having omnipotent powers over the world, so it makes sense that the all-seeing player could create multiple timelines and view all of them seeing various ways the story can go without having to destroy what they've already created. Speaking of player influence, that's actually my favorite aspect of the game's future right now. The chemistry between the characters is fantastic, but the relationship between the player and Chris is something I don't think any game has quite attempted before. Chris is their own character. The game's subtle hints at this throughout are easy to miss, but putting everything together, you start to recognize that you may be controlling Chris, but that doesn't mean they're just a stand-in for you, like just about every other game. You'll start to notice that the dialogue is written from their perspective. They'll outright refuse to do certain commands you give them. There are times where Chris is implied to be speaking with a different tone than what you might expect. The subtle differences between the uses of the name Chris and the term you have drastic implications on the meaning of certain scenes. To top it all off, your goal seems to be closing the Dark Fountains. And yet, saying the idea of a game where the player character doesn't want you there is intriguing would be an understatement. This ending opens up so many questions not just for the in-game lore, but Chris' situation itself. Does Chris know what we are? Are they aware of how we wound up controlling them? What does it feel like for them? What options would they actually choose for dialogue? What are their goals? Do they hate what we're making them do? Or do they just hate that they can't control what we decide they'll do? All of these questions have major implications for where the story will go, and right now the only potential answer I see to any of them comes in the form of the Snowgrave route. Once again, I'm borrowing footage here, but I think this may be why Chris wants to get rid of us. It's not what we're doing in the normal playthrough of the game. It's what we can do. Theoretically, the Snowgrave route is better than the Undertale Genocide route. You kill far less than an Undertale, and the ones you grow the closest with remain alive at the end. Yet it feels so much worse. I think it's because of the central theme of manipulation. In the Genocide route, you're one character hurting everyone. In the Snowgrave route, you're forcing Noelle, who's just scared and confused, to participate in your wrongdoings. Watching Noelle's antics without your dark influence, her cute interactions with Susie, adds to the uneasiness of seeing her just following along, afraid of her childhood friend. And that's the other aspect of this, and perhaps the answer to some of our earlier questions. Chris doesn't want to be doing this. Chris cares about Noelle, and now they care about Susie too. You're not just hurting Noelle, you're destroying her friendship with the character you play as. Chris knows you can do this. They know what power you hold, and that's likely why they want you out. This unique relationship between the player and Chris is what I expect to be the crux of Deltarune's story. Where it goes from here, I have no idea, but I can say that no matter what direction it goes in, it's shaping out to be an experience like no other. Would I say that Deltarune outdoes Undertale in every way, that it ultimately is the better game? Not quite yet, because the one thing Deltarune lacks is the same gut-wrenching scenes Undertale has. Deltarune's normal route at the moment is mostly just silly fun, but the stones are in place for it to surpass its former if it does so. Toby Fox stated he couldn't make a game that would make us feel like Undertale did again. But then again, Fox is notorious for underestimating just how much impact his work will have. I'm not getting my hopes up. If Deltarune really is just a silly game through and through, it'll just be one of the greatest games of all time, one which surpasses Undertale in gameplay and humor, but doesn't deliver on the emotional front. But if this is Fox being coy and Deltarune really does manage to reach those same emotional heights, well, Twilight Princess will have had a good run as my favorite game of all time. I would say Deltarune Chapter 2 is a perfect game. But no, Undertale is what I consider a perfect game. Although Deltarune isn't as emotionally impactful as Undertale quite yet, it does surpass its predecessor in other areas. Undertale's humor, writing, and gameplay is perfect for Undertale, yet Deltarune manages to somehow outdo it in all of those aspects. Whether Deltarune as a whole will surpass its predecessor remains to be seen. But right now, at least in terms of gameplay and characters, I really can't call Deltarune Chapter 2 anything but an improvement upon perfection.